Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthologies. Written by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson and Don Muchow, and narrated by Melissa Del Toro Schaffner. The Traveling Salesman, Part 9. After 3 days of wandering a hyperdimensional hallway with countless doors, my interstellar trading partner Glactyl and I, and only a half a bulb of water, finally found our way back to our ship. Not only that, we were back on Earth, a thought years from where we had been when we entered the Hall of 1,000 Doors, but we had also, somehow, traveled 12 centuries into the future. To give you an idea of just how much things had changed, start by imagining yourself immersed in a game of Dungeons and Dragons, except exchange the dragons and other mythical beasts for talking crocodiles or whatever you want. Now, erase all that and picture yourself on the bridge of Star Trek's Enterprise. That's about how much time had passed, unless you were talking about the Discovery episodes, in which case it wasn't quite that much time. During that time, the ship that we had left floating in space while we went all Stanley Kubrick had been found adrift, recovered, and brought back to Earth, where it became the central exhibit of the Bob and Glactyl Museum of Interstellar Enterprise. Which meant that we weren't likely to be able to recover it without some serious planning. Which, of course, we both got to immediately. We were interrupted by a tour guide, a frumpy woman, whose command of English was compromised by the fact that the language had changed a bit in 1,200 years, including merging with Spanish, Hindi, and Mandarin. Thank goodness Glactyl and I still wore our universal translators, which in our timeline had not exceeded their warranty. At times the translator struggled. Other times the message came through loud and clear. "Didn't you hear me? I told you two to come with me. The museum is closing. Don't make me call security." The belligerent woman wore a name tag with her name Karen. I shook my head in disbelief, not knowing that it would be possible to explain the irony of her name to Glactyl. We complied, though it felt weird. The last time I remember actually stepping off the ship was when we made landfall. Waterfall. You know what? When we stopped on the surface of the planet with the eels. That time I was up to my knees in salty water and kelpie-smelling grasses where the eels seemed to nest. It still gives me shivers. There's something about eels that I don't like. Glactyl went first, then I followed down the carpeted walkway that they had constructed to ensure the constant scuff of feet over the centuries didn't damage the ship. The tour guide sniffed the air. "You boys homeless?" "No," answered Glactyl, "although we do not currently have a place to stay, if you would be so kind as to recommend." "You sound homeless to me." She leveled her gaze at me. "You smell homeless too, particularly that one." I tried to apologize, but nothing managed to come out of my mouth. Instead, I asked, "Is there some place nearby where we can wash up? We've been, working, and our worksite has only the most primitive sanitary facilities. We would be most grateful." "Sure," she said, pointing down to a short, thankfully opaque hallway to her left. "Restrooms down at the end, second floor on the left. Don't take too long. Once we set the alarm, you're trespassing." "Yes, ma'am," I said. Glactyl and I excused ourselves, and as soon as we were out of earshot, I whispered to him, "I think that went well, don't you? We weren't arrested or anything." He glared. "We still don't have our ship, but we are alive, and at least for the moment, we know where the ship is." I washed up as well as I could, which was difficult since the restroom was a uniform white expanse with solid walls and floors. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally started waving my hands at the wall until fixtures materialized. I wasn't sure if soap was still used or if they used ionizing radiation or gamma rays, or if they microwaved the filth off your hands. One of the fixtures produced an extrusion that poured a liquid that looked like water, so I took my chances. It smelled slightly of lilacs. I decided to rub as much of the lilac water on myself as possible, particularly the areas where hygiene had been a problem before. I was grateful to be getting clean again. Moments later, there was a knock on the door. "Time's up, gentlemen! Give it a good shake, wipe off your hands, and come out, or I'm coming in!" "Be right there!" I shouted. I could hear her tapping her feet on the other side of the door. Glactyl took the few remaining seconds before I felt the tour guide would most certainly violate restroom protocols to hand me something. It was his Unitool, the multi-purpose device that had endless functions. He had just whispered that, if he didn't make it, to press the red button when I got back to the ship. That was the first sign I got that Glactyl saw our situation in a distinctly pessimistic light. Prescient, even. If that were a skill of his, it was only just now coming to light. "That's it!" we heard from the other side of the door. "We're coming in!" Then, just as we were exiting, the door opened from the other side, and there stood the tour guide and two brawny-looking security types. Perhaps owing to the fact that we were actually in the process of leaving, the security guards didn't give us much trouble. Or, I should say me, at least. They turned Glactyl around, asked him to place his hands on the wall, and took to frisking him extensively. I'm sure if I hadn't interrupted, they'd have given one of the butt probes his kind was so legendary for having administered. At least to cattle. "He's clean," one of them finally announced, who then turned to the tour guide. "What about the other one?" "I'm not worried. I know his type. He's from here. A little stupid, but polite. If he's in on some kind of con, he's in way over his head. I don't think he'll be any trouble." I felt insulted. Did I really look that stupid? Why did people always assume that I was the dumb one? Anyway, the tour guide eventually let us go, and despite my indignation and Glactyl's humiliation, we were finally off to explore 33rd century Earth. To my surprise, not much had really changed in the last 1,200 years. Earth was still overpopulated, though now even remote areas looked like downtown Tokyo. The entire planet seemed to be one massive, paved and constantly lit attraction. Kind of like Las Vegas. The air was hot, stifling, and dry. Most people went around half-clothed, but didn't seem to be enjoying it. It was harder than I thought to find lodging. Nobody wanted to take in two scruffy-looking guys dressed like they were cosplaying ancient history. And the food was awful. In other words, like a week at my Uncle Bill's house in Allentown with Aunt Teresa and every single last one of the grandkids. It was evening, and Glactyl and I were hungry. The good news was that in my haste to leave Earth after the zombie apocalypse and my subsequent election as Earth's representative to the rest of the galaxy, I had managed to pocket about $1.75 of actual loose coinage. I'm not sure in retrospect what I thought I'd use it for, but there it was, in my pocket. Somehow I had managed not to lose it in the eel swamp, or on any of our hasty exits from dicey situations. I looked around, found what I thought was a food vendor, the aroma of food was a good clue there, and asked about the menu. I guess the translator didn't work as well as it should have, because seconds later, one of the two men manning the street kiosk shouted, "Hey Anand! Get a load of this guy! Dresses old Earth and even talks a good imitation of Old English." Anand chuckled and did what most people do when they don't really know the language. He talked very slowly. "Prithee, squire," he said, "hast thou coin? He grabbed his hat, and with it still in his hand, made what I can only assume was supposed to be an elaborate Elizabethan curtsy. "Not even close," Glactyl said. "Anand, your accent and mannerisms are 500 years misplaced." "Hey, buddy," said Anand's friends. "Nobody asked your bug-eyed face." Glactyl's posture changed subtly. I can only guess that whatever predated his race evolutionarily had once used it to announce an imminent attack. "As a matter of fact, I do have coin," I said, I reached into my pocket and removed the lowest denomination I could find. A penny. Will this purchase anything? Glactyl shook his head as if to say, "This isn't going to work. You're going to get us arrested." Anand's eyes widened as he took a closer look. "Look at the date on it, Chuck. It says 2025. That's a penny, and it's over 12 centuries old. It's probably worth 20,000 credits. Even trade, then? I asked. This penny for dinner, and whatever change is left, minus a reasonable tip. Chuck looked at the penny, rolling it over in his fingers, as if he thought it was counterfeit. After a while, he decided it was real. Deal, he said, and a short while later, he brought out 2 steaming plates of meat on what looked like rice. What did we order? Glactyl asked. Hamster, said Chuck. Top-of-the-line real meat on synth rice. Then Chuck handed me a thick plastic card. Didn't see a comms bracelet or ID, just the old translator prop, he said. So I figured you were in deep character. The card has your remaining 19,781 credits. I blinked in surprise. They must have automatically determined their value as nearly extinct coins. It seemed that the 1,200-year coin was worth a small fortune, and I still had more coins to convert. Glactyl took the news better than I did. He simply shrugged and continued to munch voraciously on the hamster. I couldn't stomach it, and frankly, there wasn't enough meat. I ate the synth rice and found it strangely fulfilling. I have very sensitive nostrils, you know, said Glactyl, and for the first time ever I noticed that indeed he did have the rudiments of a nose. I can tell the exact chemical composition of most organics, including toxins, the products of high-temperature heat stress on proteins, and accidental inclusions of native wildlife. Would you like to know what's in the synth rice? No, I said, with as much force as possible. And hell no. Just trying to be useful. Don't try so hard, I said. So now what? Asked Glactyl. I suppose we should find lodging. With the credit voucher the street vendor gave you, I assume we shall not have as much trouble as previously thought. Right, I said, holding up the card. Let's go see what this baby'll buy. Glactyl and I walked a few blocks, and I was grateful that wherever we were, nothing was very far away. And as it turns out, we weren't that far from Uncle Bill's, if his home were even still around. We were in a town called Hazleton, but it looked, for all intents and purposes, like New York City. Mid-rise buildings stretched out in all directions, punctuated by flashing signs announcing, "We have rat!" and "Cockroach au gratin special," only 3 credits. It made me wonder why gratin was in parentheses. My stomach churned. The synth rice had not agreed with it, but I had made Glactyl swear he would not tell me what was in it. I could only hope it was vaguely vegetarian. About half a mile away from the museum, we stumbled across a place called Aquifer House, which looked like a boutique hotel. I chatted with a lady at the counter who turned out to be an android. She explained in canned Spanglish to Sharon that the location had been one of the town's last standing tattoo parlors, 300 years ago, and that the owners had been driven bankrupt when the singularity struck. She seemed proud of that fact. It is unusual, she said, to receive guests. Most, she looked strangely at Glactyl, humans do not carry a significant amount of disposable income, since they do not generally require income. Your party must not be from around here. I presume you are citizens of the Enterprise, especially since you are not accompanied by a servitor-class droid. What's that mean? I asked. We've been off-planet for a while. Explain. Citizens of Enterprise is a term used principally in relation to thieves, assassins, and prostitutes, she replied, though occasionally it referred to merchants of questionable provenance. Most of the people remaining on planet do not work. They do not have to. She smiled. What's your name? I asked. Sarah. Your real name? My model and serial number? That's personal, said Sarah. You only barely know me. Sarah disappeared for a moment, and when I say that, I mean she turned transparent and then invisible. A moment later, she returned. In fact, we do have a room, number 213, upstairs, at the end of the hall and to your right. The maidbot is still cleaning it, but it will be ready momentarily. Your total for the night will be 179 credits. That entitles you to the continental breakfast. What's for breakfast? Asked Glactyl. I rolled my eyes. You shouldn't have asked. Eggs, replied Sarah. For a moment, my stomach got excited, and then she asked, cockroach or cicada? We retired to our quarters. Glactyl ordered some cicada eggs and more of that formaldehyde stuff. And as he slept on what I assume was a sofa, I looked for a way to get online the local computer internet, though they now called it the HoloNet, so that I could sell a few more coins to local antiquities dealers. It took me some time to figure out the HoloNet interface and negotiate my way around what remained of the dark net, and pawn off the remaining dimes and nickels that I possessed. Then I just browsed. After all, a lot had happened in the last 1,200 years, and there was a lot to catch up on. Along the way, I dug up some interesting facts on the long-dead dirt on the original privateers who had attacked us back on Algar, where we had mined magnetic monopoles. It appeared that their progeny were now respected trader dynasties. Thinking of a way to leverage that information, I posted a message on the HoloNet where I thought they would see it. Then I finally turned in myself. It had been a very long day. The next morning, Glactyl and I returned to the museum. This time freshly washed and in contemporary attire. At least now, though, we had a small discretionary budget. With part of it, I purchased Harold, a used servitor that had been on a 60% markdown. It had a goofy facial expression and a bowl cut that made him look like Mo from the Three Stooges. I had wanted a female servitor, but Glactyl decided against it. When we bought it, the merchant who sold it to us demanded cash only and warned there would be no refunds or returns. I figured it was probably either stolen or broken, but it was able to walk on its own, and that was sufficient for our current needs, which was hauling around our shopping bags. Speaking of bags, I had also bought a new day bag to carry the artifact that Glactyl had kept tucked in his clothing for way too long. I reminded myself to wash it the next chance I got. The fashions of the day were not exactly to my taste, but I have to admit that, given what we had done to the planet in the last 1,000 years or so, the protective UV gear was welcome. Pure reflective white tunics, solar fan-powered desert hats, and brightly colored wraparound sunglasses made for a look that was part Lawrence of Arabia, part Logan's Run, and part Parliament Funkadelic, especially the Bootsy Collins platform shoes. Glactyl seemed considerably more comfortable than I. However, his hat didn't quite fit, and he was constantly adjusting his sunglasses. We returned to the museum, and the tour guide Karen barely recognized us. I waved a credit voucher at her and announced with some ceremony, "My partner and I apologize for our disheveled entry yesterday. We would like to request a private tour of the facilities." She looked nonplussed. "What, you mean now?" "Now," said Glactyl, conjuring up an intimidating look that was one of the best bad cop routines I'd ever seen. "But," said tour guide, "I'd have to cancel all of today's tickets." "How much would that cost?" I asked. "At least 500 credits. "Slow day?" I asked. "How about 1,000? 1,200. 1,300, announced Harold. "Stop it, Harry. You're not bidding on this. I am." 1,100, I said. "But you need to throw in some decent food. I haven't eaten today. And none of those damned cicada eggs or rat steaks." I glowered at Harold. "And maybe some mind lube for my bot." Harry returned a vacant-minded expression. "I'll see what I can do," said the tour guide. Then she turned and went to the podium by the main entrance to check how many tickets had been sold for the day. As soon as she had gone, I asked Glactyl, "So, what's your plan? Why are we here?" "We're going to take back our ship." How? I countered. The ship probably doesn't even work anymore. It's been too long. Before he could explain, Karen returned and promptly said, Fine, you've purchased the facilities for the day and I can give you a tour whenever you like. She then handed me several wrapped bars. What are these? I asked. That's the food you wanted. And they're not cicada eggs or rat steaks. They're generic high-protein bars, specially made for the museum. Examining the nutrient bars, I noted that they were labeled B&G energy bars. Great, I thought. We've been immortalized in junk food. Glactyl flashed me an approving smile. I like the cicada eggs, he said. Lots of protein. Cicada eggs are low-carbon footprint organics. They are nutritionally complete and a good source of complex carbs, fat, and dietary fiber, announced Harold. Part of a balanced breakfast. Happy to hear that, I said, not happy at all. I didn't even want to think about cicada eggs. Glactyl smiled. That's more sarcasm, isn't it? I must confess, I believe I am getting better at spotting it. So tell me, said Karen, where would you like to start your tour? We should begin at the gift shop and the small canteen we maintain here. We could then move to that gallery which displays items that used to belong to Bob and Glactyl. Then there's the exhibit with the virtual tour that highlights their many adventures, as well as the ship itself. The bridge, Glactyl said quickly, cutting her off. Take us to the bridge first. All right, she said. Then she turned and headed to the gantry that led to the ship. We followed her. As we passed one of the security guards who had been there the previous night, I threw him a facetious, toothy grin. Harry mimicked my expression, which made it much more comical. I was beginning to like the guy already. To the tour guide's credit, as we walked through the ship on the way to the bridge, she did provide us with a very detailed private tour. She never shut up. I swear, she never even took time to take a breath. Glactyl and I quickly learned that, apart from the parts of the ship that were expected to retire regular service, just about everything was as it had been left. It hadn't been looted or even repainted. The original furnishings looked as new as anything you'd have seen at Buckingham Palace after 1,000 years of royals plopping their lily-white butts in them and sipping tea. The staff had even taken care to keep things dusted and had even replaced a broken glass panel that had been that way when we first acquired the ship. As we walked, I asked, "Tell me about the museum's foundation." "Well," said the tour guide, "we do our best to preserve not just the appearance of the ship, but also its function. Very few of what we call first-generation Alcubierre superluminals have survived more than a few generations. It seems the unstable fuel that powers the coils winding the canonical vacuum generators has a rather short half-life, on the order of a century or so. Without discoveries of fresh new deposits, it rapidly becomes useless. The second-generation survey ships found quite a few junkers that were clearly abandoned by crews unable to afford the upkeep. Bob and Glactyl's ship is one of the best-preserved historical specimens." "It is the best-preserved specimen," added Harry. "To date, there are only 14 first-generation superluminals in existence, 3 of which are operational, including this one. The other 2 are in the possession of collectors, principally the Drimjack and Ctholon trading dynasties." "Fascinating," said Glactyl. "Do go on." I wasn't sure if he actually meant it or was just trying to appear to be a good listener. Harry started to launch into another informative lecture when Glactyl cut him off. "I meant for the tour guide to continue." "Oh, sorry," replied Harry. The 3 of us continued walking deeper into the ship. Presently, we passed a series of storerooms where we had stashed a lot of our gear. In the distance ahead, I imagined the smell of lunabars that I used to keep there. My stomach growled. The tour guide continued. "Bob and Glactyl's ship, designated ODD TOI-2812 was found in the vicinity of one of the first habitable worlds discovered by Earth's mighty telescopes, TOI-700D, she said. Legend has it that something went wrong, but before they left the ship, the co-pilot Glactyl programmed it with a homing signal, so it would return to a world where they were capable of surviving. However, no one knows what really happened to them. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone. Even their pantry remained untouched. Bob was quite fond of packaged Earth foods, announced Harry, principally those which contained soy protein isolate, oat flour, chicory root fiber, palm kernel solids, dried berries, pulverized cocoa, and peanut flour, and other natural ingredients. Jesus, I thought, does everyone know about that? However, they also contain nuts, Harold continued blithely. Do not consume any if you have or suspect you have a nut allergy. The smell of 1,000-year-old Luna bars can be like cocaine when you haven't eaten anything but synth rice and stale bulb water in days. I was more than a little hungry. Glactyl didn't seem bothered. I guess he'd had his fill of cicada eggs and hamster nuggets. May I asked, as we reached the galley. I, for one, would like to see what happens to 1,000-year-old Luna bars. Glactyl looked at me blankly over his shoulder. Tour guide stared right at me. How, she asked, did you know they were called Luna bars? Our private guided tour came to an abrupt stop with that one slip. Things had been going so well up until that point. I began to explain. That is, my partner is an archaeologist, Glactyl explained. His dissertation was on the diet of ancient Earthlings, specifically those of the 21st century. Isn't that right, Dr. Caldwell? Yeah, I responded. Of particular interest were the preserved food products they carried during excursions, especially as fossil fuels became scarcer and before the electric revolution. People, ran, walked, or cycled long distances, relying on them as fuel. Once, I thought, I even got a medal for a 10K run when I was 18. Of course, that had been back before I met an alien and became a trillionaire, interstellar trader, and dimension-folding time traveler after escaping an Earth that had succumbed to both the zombie apocalypse and environmental disaster. Tour guide was saying something, but my attention had wandered, and I hadn't a clue what she was saying. Regardless, she seemed convinced enough, and thankfully I had either leveled up in cleverness to the point at which I knew when to shut up, or I had been distracted long enough for her to assume the facts stood as I had offered. That almost ended badly, whispered Glactyl. We were one step away from... I know, I said. Sorry about that. It's just that I was hungry. Don't worry, said Glactyl. We'll find you something to eat. I have a plan. Harry had, for some unknown reason, taken to whistling as he sauntered randomly down the hallway. He appeared to be enjoying himself. I didn't know androids could do either one of those things. Our tour guide pointed ahead and quickened her pace. I have something I'd like to show you, gentlemen, she said. The bridge. We followed the tour guide as she entered the main control room. Harold listened attentively to Karen, periodically correcting minor details in her memorized lecture. Then, I noticed that my day bag was still there where I'd left it, sitting in the co-pilot seat, where I'd placed it just after removing the Zill artifact. There were even remains of a couple Luna bars, and I wondered if they would be edible after all these years. Then, before Karen could intervene, I grabbed one, tore open the wrapper, and shoved the entire bar into my mouth. I closed my eyes momentarily to savor the taste of a Luna bar, but immediately expelled out the contents of my mouth, spitting the foul-tasting remnants of the desiccated confection. Ugh! Ugh! I squawked, trying to clear my mouth. It's horrible! It tastes like chalk! Karen shook her head and scolded me. Oh, you shouldn't touch those. They're only props, placed there to replicate the condition of the ship just as it was when it was found. Don't touch anything else while I continue your tour. Glactyl laughed at me and whispered, "It was probably made of chalk or wax. You're lucky. I can't imagine what a 1,200-year-old candy bar would have tasted like anyway." I pouted silently, wishing I had something to wash my mouth out with and wishing even more for a real Luna bar. Instead, I took one of the B&G protein bars, hoping it would remove the taste in my mouth. Glactyl turned away, appearing to examine the bridge controls. Ignoring Karen's overly rehearsed lecture, I found myself staring out the front window at the stars. It was the same old starfield we had always seen. Then, I realized that it was just a 3D rendering, then a real starscape. It was daytime outside, and I shouldn't have been able to see the stars. All I was seeing was nothing more than a projected image of the nighttime sky. It was just another prop for the exhibit. As Karen droned on about the operational status of the ship, Glactyl whispered, "Bob." I thought about how much had changed. For a moment, everything seemed surreal. It was as if space had folded once more and everything was different. Maybe not even the same universe. "Bob!" repeated Glactyl, a little louder. "What?" Hearing his name, the tour guide stopped and glared at me. "That's funny, Dr. Caldwell," said tour guide. "Your name's Bob, too, just like the original Bob and Glactyl. It's not at all common anymore." I smiled. "It's just a coincidence." "Bob, do you remember that object I gave you before my pat-down yesterday?" said Glactyl. "Yeah, the Unitool?" I asked. "It's the key," he said. Since he was behind tour guide, he motioned in an exaggerated way at the bridge. But I didn't get the meaning at first. "The key to what?" "You know," Glactyl said. He dragged it out like it was the punchline of a joke I was supposed to get. Except I didn't. Maybe I was stupid. "Wait," said Harold. "Let me guess." "Harold, stay out of this." Wondering what Glactyl was going on about, Karen turned toward him, but didn't get to say anything before he said, "Press the red button." I took out the Unitool that Glactyl had handed me just before he was frisked by the security guard. Now I know why he'd done that. If he'd had it in his possession, they'd have thought he was absconding with something valuable from the museum, which in a way he was, since they were his keys. "The red button, Bob. Press it, now." When I pressed it, all the external bulkhead doors closed, and Glactyl, Harold, tour guide, and I all suddenly lurched backward as the 1,200-year-old Casimir vacuum generators roared to life. The fuel cores cracked with energy, and the museum groaned, lifted, and escaped its moorings, leaving a crumbling building behind as it rose into the sky. To be continued in Part 10, when Bob and Glactyl regain their ship and confront new enemies. Thank you for listening. You may notice it's becoming easier and easier to interact with us and support the show. We love our listeners, fans, and patrons. Please share this podcast with your friends and family and anybody who might be a sci-fi buff. We know they'll love it. And if you'd like to support the show for about 1 cup of coffee a month, you can go to the link on the bottom of the show notes in every episode and find a Support This Podcast link. We value bringing original, high-quality short stories to you every month, and we appreciate your support to keep this podcast ad-free. Thank you so much, and have a great day.